She was just 12 years old when her world turned to ashes, staring down from a stone tower as flames devoured her homeland, and by the time she turned 16, she was forced to marry the man who had conquered her people. This is not merely a story of a royal bride, but of a child queen who was thrust into a battlefield far bloodier than any war. A medieval tragedy buried beneath centuries of silence, now finally emerging into the light as one of the most harrowing chapters in European history and the forgotten queens of history whose names deserve to echo through time. This is the story of Anne of Brittany, a young girl who became the most tragic queen Europe ever knew, whose fate would be chained to forced marriages, brutal political games, and the relentless expectation to produce an heir, all while carrying the weight of her people's last hopes on shoulders that should have borne nothing heavier than a child's laughter. And as the wind howled through the battlements of Château de Nantes, Anne of Brittany pressed her face against the cold glass, watching enemy banners multiply across her horizon like a plague of locusts, while the acrid scent of burning villages rose like an omen in the winter sky, and each clang of steel upon steel whispered a dark promise that queens were not forged in jeweled halls, but hammered into shape upon the anvils of conquest and suffering. And though history would record her as the Duchess who vanished into the crown of France, hidden history reveals a woman who refused to vanish entirely, carving out moments of power even as kings tried to reduce her to a pawn. And so, before we dive deeper into the forgotten truths, if stories like this stir your fascination for dark history, medieval history, and the untold resilience of women in power, consider subscribing and joining this journey through the shadows of royal destinies. Because what Anne endured was more than tragedy. It was the raw testament of a woman who learned that even in chains she could still rule. In the dying embers of the 15th century, as Europe shifted and groaned beneath the weight of kingdoms expanding like greedy tides, there existed a land that seemed carved from an older world, a stubborn patch of earth known as Brittany, where hidden history and forgotten queens of history still whispered among oak groves, where the salt spray of the Atlantic lashed granite cliffs, and the Breton language flowed like honey on the tongues of fishermen and farmers, whose blood carried the memory of ancient Celts who had refused to bow even as empires rose and fell around them. For Brittany was more than a duchy. It was the last free Celtic nation on the continent, a sovereign realm fiercely protective of its independence, standing as both thorn and prize to the growing might of France, a jewel that kings and conquerors alike coveted, because to possess Brittany was to hold not merely land, but a gateway to the seas, and the prestige of bending an entire people to one's will. And it was in this land of mist and defiance that Anne of Brittany was born, destined to become not only a duchess, but one of the most tragic and compelling figures in medieval history and European history. Though as she played as a child within her father's fortress, she could never have imagined how quickly those high stone walls would become both her cage and her battlefield. For even as she laughed in sunlit courtyards, the storm clouds of royal ambition gathered over her future, unseen but inevitable. And the clash between ancient freedom and royal conquest loomed closer with every heartbeat. Because Brittany's existence as an independent duchy was an anomaly that could not last, not when France's kings dreamed of empire and not when dynastic marriages were the most potent weapons in a king's arsenal. For history has shown that sometimes kingdoms fall not with the roar of cannon, but with the whisper of a marriage vow. It was Anne's father, Duke Francis II, who stood as the last wall against French domination, a man who cherished Brittany's independence with a fervor bordering on obsession, but fate dealt its cruelest blow when he died in 1488, leaving behind no sons to inherit his title, only two daughters, Anne and her younger sister. And in a medieval world where royal marriages and women in power were less about love and more about political calculation, the absence of a male heir transformed Anne overnight from a carefree girl into Europe's most valuable bargaining chip, a prize over whom kings would wage silent wars with marriage contracts. And from the moment news of Francis's death echoed through the gilded halls of Europe, the vultures began circling, because whoever controlled Anne would control Brittany, and in the eyes of monarchs, she was not a girl but a piece of strategic real estate, a living claim that could be bought, traded, or conquered. And thus Brittany's fate hung by the fragile thread of a teenage girl's body and her ability to produce heirs for Charles VIII of France, barely older than Anne himself, watched with the cold precision of a young king who smelled opportunity, for he saw Brittany as unfinished business, a thorn left festering from the days of his predecessors, while across the mountains and valleys of the Holy Roman Empire. Maximilian, a man known as Maximilian the Fearless, cast his calculating eyes westward, seeing in Anne a potential pawn in his endless chess match with France, eager to tether Brittany into his empire and thereby tighten the Habsburg grip upon Europe. And as diplomats scurried between courts, parchment crinkling beneath the weight of dynastic ambition, Anne stood within her father's tomb, tears streaming down her cheeks as candle flames danced on cold stone, entirely unaware that even as she grieved, powerful men were already scribbling her name into treaties she would never see, contracts that would dictate her womb, her crown, and the freedom or subjugation of her homeland. And though the chronicles of medieval history often speak of kings and battles and treaties signed under the glare of heraldic banners, the real war was being fought in silence in secret meetings behind castle doors, where a teenage girl's destiny was bartered like a prized mare, and in the shadows of Brittany's great oaks, winds carried the scent of salt and secrets, as if the land itself knew that the days of freedom were numbered, because while Brittany's dukes had ruled independently for centuries, the tide of history was changing, and kingdoms were swallowing duchies, and the age of small sovereignties was dying, and Anne, though yet unaware, was about to be thrust into the fiercest battle of all the war, for her own body, her own heart, and the fragile freedom of her people. And as the sun set over the stone towers of Château de Nantes, casting long shadows across its battlements, a young girl stood silent, caught between childhood and queenship, between freedom and the iron grip of royal marriages, not yet knowing that in the coming years she would be forced to gamble everything, even the sanctity of her own flesh, in a desperate bid to save her duchy. But one question lingered like an echo in the cold Breton winds, demanding an answer. Could a child queen trapped in the game of kings truly change the fate written for her? And it is to that desperate gamble we turn next, as Anne dares a move that would ignite the fury of France and set in motion the next bloodier chapter of her hidden history. Beneath the chill vaults of Brittany's stone chambers, as candle flames flickered over walls etched with centuries of triumph and betrayal, a decision was made by a girl not yet 13. A choice that would ignite the wrath of kings and tilt the balance of European history itself, for Anne of Brittany, caught between grief and encroaching conquest, chose to risk everything in one bold stroke, marrying by proxy the man she believed could shield her homeland from the ever-tightening vice of French ambition. And in that secret ceremony, hidden from the eyes of both friend and enemy, Anne stood trembling as a stranger held her slender hand, reciting vows in Latin phrases that fell heavy as iron shackles upon the cold flagstones. And though the groom was not present, Maximilian, the fearless Holy Roman Emperor and towering figure in the chronicles of medieval history, had sent his proxy to claim the young duchess as his bride, believing that through this union he could interpose the might of the Habsburgs between Brittany and the insatiable hunger of France, for, in the chessboard of royal marriages, Anne had transformed from mere duchess to queen on the brink of becoming a Habsburg pawn. A girl whose marriage bed was destined to become a battlefield where dynasties clashed in silence. And though she scarcely understood the web of political machinations surrounding her, she understood this. She was choosing defiance, choosing to gamble that an emperor's name might frighten the French king into retreat. But what Anne could not yet grasp was that Charles VIII of France, barely older than herself, wore a crown forged in the fires of relentless ambition, and he would not yield Brittany to the Habsburgs, not even to the mighty Maximilian, for Charles saw Anne not as a bride, but as a key, a living lock that could open the gates of Brittany to the kingdom of France. And so, while Anne prayed that the gilded eagles of the Holy Roman Empire might darken the skies above her duchy in righteous defense, Charles marshaled his armies, swords flashing in the pale sun like silver fish darting through turbulent waters, and as diplomats scrambled, dispatches flew across Europe, carrying news of Anne's secret vows, each word written in invisible ink of blood and iron. For if Brittany belonged to the empire, The delicate balance of power that underpinned all of Europe would tilt toward the Habsburgs, threatening France's security, and ambitions from Naples to Flanders, and thus the young King of France made his choice, and it was not diplomacy. It was war, for Charles VIII would rather scorch Brittany to blackened earth than see it slip into Habsburg hands. And so, as Anne stood cloaked in cold stone silence, the first whispers of the French invasion rippled through the Breton court, like a chill draft through a crypt, and her advisors, grim-faced and speaking in urgent tones, told her that her proxy marriage was but a fragile shield against the mailed fist of France, and Anne, who had once believed marriage might save her country, now saw the truth glinting like the edge of a sword in the game of kings. Promises made to teenage girls were worth less than the parchment upon which they were scrawled. And the very vows that should have protected her were now the spark that would set Brittany ablaze. For Charles moved swiftly, dispatching seasoned generals and cunning envoys, each step tightening the noose around the young duchess's realm. And as the Holy Roman Emperor remained preoccupied with his own struggles in distant lands, no imperial banners appeared on the horizon. No thunder of cavalry echoed through the Breton valleys, only the drumbeat of French armies marching closer, fortress by fortress, falling like dying stars, and the air above Brittany grew heavy with smoke, with the scent of charred villages and broken hopes, and yet in the deepest shadows of Anne's fear flickered a spark of steel. For she was no longer merely the daughter of a dead duke, but a ruler determined to fight. Though the odds were monstrous, and as she stared out from the ramparts of Château de Nantes, watching French banners sprout like crimson wounds upon the horizon, one truth blazed within her. If she was to lose, she would not lose quietly, and so begins the next act of this dark history, as the armies of France descend upon Brittany, and Anne must stand against the tide, knowing that the real siege to come would not only test her walls, but break her heart. And it is into that storm we must now venture, where steel clashes against stone, and a teenage queen faces a war that no marriage vows can stop. As the winter of 1491 clawed its icy fingers across Brittany's rugged coastlines, the duchy that had stood free for centuries shuddered under the relentless hammer of French ambition. For Charles VIII, his eyes blazing with the fervor of conquest, unleashed his armies upon Anne's homeland with the cold precision of a predator stalking prey. And the invasion was not merely a clash of soldiers, but a deliberate strangulation, fortress by fortress falling like severed limbs. Supply lines sliced apart, until hunger became the sharpest weapon in the French king's arsenal, and inside the high walls of Rennes, Anne of Brittany, barely 15 yet already worn by grief and responsibility, stood upon the battlements, her small figure silhouetted against a horizon crawling with enemy banners that multiplied like a deadly rash across the frost-bitten fields, while the distant thunder of French cannons cracked the air like divine judgment. And though her advisors murmured strategies in hushed tones, Anne's ears rang with a single chilling truth. Brittany could not win this war, not against the overwhelming might of France, whose coffers overflowed with gold and whose armies marched with the confidence of destiny, and the marriage vows she had sworn by proxy to Maximilian the Fearless now lay crumpled and powerless, for no imperial cavalry rode to save her. No Habsburg banners unfurled upon the Breton hillsides, and the realization crashed down upon Anne like stone falling into deep water, that in the ruthless ledger of European history, promises made to teenage girls were often the first casualties. And even as the people of Rennes gnawed bread crusts down to dust, hoping against hope for relief, Anne must have stood there trembling, wondering whether surrender would save lives or condemn her duchy to eternal chains, because in the brutal game of royal marriages and political conquest, a queen's body was territory, and her heart was collateral. And as the siege dragged on, famine gnawed at the spirit of Brittany, smoke spiraled skyward from torched villages, and Anne's eyes hollow with exhaustion, yet burning with the stubborn fire of her Celtic blood, realized that even a duchess must sometimes bow to survival, for the price of continued resistance was no longer measured only in stone walls and soldiers' blood, but in the starving cries of innocent families trapped behind her city gates. And so she chose surrender, though the terms Charles offered were as savage as any blow delivered by sword or cannon. Because not only was Anne forced to renounce her marriage to Maximilian, stripping away her last fragile hope of protection, But Charles demanded she become his bride, sealing the conquest of Brittany with a wedding ring forged from humiliation and royal greed. And on the frigid day of December 6, 1491, Anne, her slender hands trembling like reeds in the wind, stood inside the grand cathedral of Langeais, where golden tapestries shimmered beneath high vaulted ceilings, and the air reeked of incense and politics, and placed her fingers into those of Charles VIII, a king just 21, yet already hardened by the ruthless calculus of power. And though the ceremony glittered with cloth of gold jewels and the approving gazes of hundreds of courtiers who bowed low while whispering cruel jests behind her back, Anne's gaze remained distant hollow, for she knew she was not merely marrying a man, but signing the death warrant of Breton independence, condemned to become an ornamental prisoner, draped in silks, yet chained in ways no iron could equal. For the marriage contract was a masterpiece of medieval cruelty, stipulating that if Charles died before Anne, she would be required to marry his successor, transforming her from a duchess into a hereditary asset to be passed from king to king. And on that night, beneath the cold gaze of saints sculpted in stone, Anne stepped into her wedding chamber, where opulent tapestries depicted scenes of conquest and irony too bitter to bear. And what occurred between her and Charles was no tender consummation, but an act of conquest more intimate and more violating than any battlefield. And though chronicles would record the marriage as a triumph for France, they could not capture the silent tears of a 16-year-old girl who had once dreamed of ruling her duchy in freedom and who now found herself trapped in a gilded cage. But from that dark threshold of despair would rise a queen stronger than any had imagined. And as Anne endured her first nights beside a king who claimed her body and her crown, another battle was already brewing. Not one of swords, but of survival and cunning. And it is to that new battlefield we must turn next, where Anne begins to discover that even queens held captive might yet wield the sharpest weapons of all their intellect, their resilience and the fierce determination never to be forgotten in the annals of dark history and hidden history. In the gilded corridors of the French court, where velvet curtains whispered secrets and jeweled courtiers moved like chess pieces across marble floors, Anne of Brittany found herself a queen in name, but a prisoner in truth, bound by vows forged under duress and weighed down by the crushing expectation that her womb alone could solidify the union of Brittany and France. For while the chronicles of medieval history and European history might speak of crowns and alliances, the true battleground was Anne's own body, a realm besieged again and again by the brutal rhythm of pregnancy and loss. And no sooner had she survived the raw humiliation of her wedding night than the eyes of the entire kingdom turned upon her, watching with merciless scrutiny for signs of swelling belly and the promise of an heir, because in the ruthless game of royal marriages and dynastic ambition, a queen's worth was measured in sons, and Anne, whose spirit had once burned with the wild freedom of the Breton coast, now found herself reduced to little more than a vessel, her every breath calculated for the possibility of securing France's future. And in the cold stone chambers of palaces glittering with gold, she endured her first pregnancy, a turbulent storm of nausea, fever, and dread, haunted by the knowledge that the life inside her might either save her people or seal her fate. And though physicians muttered soothing reassurances, Anne's instincts screamed otherwise, for she knew the price of hope in a world ruled by men who saw women as walking treaties. And when her first child arrived lifeless, tiny and perfect, yet breathless in her trembling arms, the grief that exploded within her was not merely a mother's sorrow, but a queen's political catastrophe. For instantly the whispers began echoing through tapestried halls, and echoing off painted ceilings was, "She cursed. Was Brittany cursed? Was God himself punishing France for daring to bind a Celtic duchess into the crown and Charles VIII?" The king who had ripped her homeland from her grasp showed no grief for their lost child, but instead calculated the next opportunity for conception, coldly fixated on the ticking clock of succession. And Anne, even as her body bled and her spirit cracked beneath the weight of sorrow, was offered no time to heal. For the French court, intoxicated with its own grandeur, demanded another pregnancy as though simply ordering another round of jewels or silk. and so began the brutal cycle that would define Anne's years with Charles' pregnancy. Fleeting hope, then crushing loss, each miscarriage chiseling lines into her young face and stealing pieces of her once untamed spirit. And yet even in this abyss, Anne learned the quiet art of survival, teaching herself to endure the intimate violence of her marriage by crafting an inner fortress no conqueror could breach. And as Charles grew increasingly obsessed with his Italian campaigns pouring gold and blood into the fruitless pursuit of Naples, he abandoned the duties of ruling his own kingdom, leaving a silent, grief-scarred queen to navigate the corridors of power alone. And it was here in the shadows cast by absent kings that Anne began to reveal the steel beneath her sorrow. For while courtiers gossiped and foreign ambassadors sent cryptic dispatches back to their masters, Anne studied documents, convened councils, and brokered quiet deals that kept the realm from splintering under the weight of its young monarch's reckless ambitions. And thus, while Europe thought of her merely as a tragic bride, Anne of Brittany was evolving into one of the most significant women in power, hidden within the pages of hidden history and forgotten queens of history. A queen who, even trapped in a gilded cage, learned how to twist its bars into tools of influence. And though her body continued to betray her with cruel regularity, pregnancies ending in silent chambers where priestly prayers could not summon life. Anne's mind grew sharper, her political instincts honed to a blade, and in the rare moments when Charles returned from war, he found a wife who no longer wept in helpless terror, but wielded silence like a weapon, choosing her words, as carefully as a swordsman chooses his strikes. And it is here, amid palace intrigue and private agony, that we glimpse Anne's transformation from victim to strategist, a woman forced to wear a crown fashioned from her own suffering. And yet even as her power grew, the shadow of her failures in the royal nursery hung over her like a curse, for without a living male heir, France's future trembled on the brink, and the murmurs of discontent slithered through court like a serpent in silk, whispering of annulments of replacements of a queen unworthy of her golden throne. And though Anne fought with all the silent ferocity of a queen, determined never to vanish from European history, the king who bound her fate would soon fall in a twist of fate as abrupt as it was ironic. And it is to that moment we now turn to witness how even kings can be toppled, not by armies, but by the most mundane hazard of all, a low doorway in a royal palace, and how that single blow would set Anne on a path toward yet another crown, another prison, and another desperate battle to hold on to the fragments of her freedom. In the labyrinthine corridors of Château d'Amboise, where painted ceilings arched like the vaults of a cathedral, and sunlight streamed through stained glass to splash crimson and gold upon polished floors, destiny tripped upon the simplest of obstacles. For Charles VIII. The king who had wrested Brittany from Anne's desperate grasp met his end not on a battlefield, nor beneath the weight of royal conspiracies, but by striking his head on a low doorway as he strode through the palace's echoing galleries. And so, in a moment that reads almost absurd in the annals of European history and medieval history, the king who had claimed Anne as both bride and trophy fell victim to architecture collapsing to the marble with the abruptness of a felled tree, and as physicians rushed in their robes flaring like frightened birds, there was no saving him from the grim finality that even monarchs cannot escape, for within hours Charles was dead, leaving behind a throne trembling with uncertainty, and a queen who had suffered beneath his rule, yet now found herself abruptly unbound. And though the French court reeled in shock, their gasps echoing off the cold stone, Anne of Brittany stood upon the threshold of a freedom she could scarcely believe, for the marriage contract that had shackled her to Charles now lay shattered by death, offering a fleeting glimpse of a life that might finally be hers to command. And yet, as always in the hidden corridors of power, chronicled by hidden history and forgotten queens of history, that taste of freedom proved as bitter as it was sweet, because the ink of politics dries faster than the tears of queens. And according to the cruel stipulations embedded within the very marriage contract Anne had been forced to sign, she was now required to marry Charles's successor, ensuring Brittany remained forever entangled in the golden chains of the French crown. And so the eyes of France turned immediately to Louis, Duke of Orléans, the man destined to ascend as Louis XIII, whose ambitions burned as fiercely as any king's. And yet Louis carried an obstacle that complicated the swift absorption of Anne back into royal bondage, for he was already bound in matrimony to Joan of France, the daughter of Louis XIV. And thus began one of the most sordid and cynical chapters in royal marriages, a scandal that slithered through the courts of Europe like a venomous serpent, because Louis, hungry for both the crown and Anne's claim to Brittany, petitioned the Pope for an annulment, declaring in cold clinical terms that Joan was physically deformed and incapable of consummating their marriage, a claim as cruel as it was politically convenient, and thus the papal courts found themselves dragged into the dark heart of medieval power plays, forced to adjudicate the intimate details of a royal woman's body, while Europe looked on morbidly fascinated. And as the legal arguments unfurled, casting Joan as a pitiable creature unsuited for queenship, Anne watched with horror and growing dread, for in Joan's humiliation she saw a chilling mirror of her own possible fate, a reminder that in the realm of kings and hidden history, queens were not women, but assets, obstacles, and bargaining chips to be discarded when inconvenient. And yet even as Louis maneuvered to cast off his loyal wife, whispers in the French court flickered like candle flames would Anne, once widowed, now find the strength to refuse another royal chain? Or would she once more be forced into a marriage forged in the fires of dynastic ambition? And while Joan, pious and soft-spoken, retreated to a convent cloaked in public pity and private devastation, Anne of Brittany stood at a new crossroads, her heart torn between the hope of genuine autonomy and the crushing weight of royal expectation. For she knew better than anyone that queens who resist the tide of kings risk drowning beneath waves of political retribution. And though the chronicles of European history might simply record dates and titles, the truth shimmering beneath those inked lines is that Anne understood exactly what awaited her if she allowed herself to be swept away again. For in Joan's fall, Anne glimpsed the scaffold upon which her own freedom might be executed, and so she resolved that this time, should she marry again, it would be on terms carved from her own iron will, a decision that would set the stage for one of the most audacious negotiations ever undertaken by a medieval queen. And it is to that quiet yet ferocious chess match we must now turn, where Anne of Brittany, battered yet unbowed, prepares to bargain not merely for her crown, but for the right to shape her own destiny in the chronicles of dark history and women in power. In the echoing silence that followed Charles VIII's sudden demise, while the banners of France hung limp in the spring breeze and the courtiers whispered their prayers and intrigues, in equal measure Anne of Brittany, newly widowed yet far from defeated, stood poised upon the blade's edge between captivity and sovereignty. For though her heart surely reeled from years of forced unions and the relentless bloodletting of motherhood, she had learned that even queens bound in golden cages could sharpen those bars into weapons of negotiation. And so when Louis XIV cast his calculating gaze toward the Breton Duchess, determined to bind her once more into the French crown and secure both her person and her precious duchy, he found himself confronted not by a frightened girl, but by a woman who had survived the cruelest trials that European history and medieval history could inflict upon a royal woman. A woman whose mind had been forged in the fires of hidden history and who now refused to be pawn or trophy ever again. And while Europe buzzed with scandal over Louis's annulment of his first wife Joan, who retreated into a convent cloaked in pity and sorrow, Anne seized the moment to do what few women of her time could even imagine. She laid her own terms upon the royal table, and in this quiet yet ferocious dance of royal marriages and dynastic ambition, Anne wielded her grief, her reputation, and her irreplaceable value as the Duchess of Brittany, like daggers glinting in candlelight. For she knew that Louis, despite his newfound throne, could not afford to alienate her people, nor allow Brittany to slip back into Habsburg influence through another political alliance, and so she demanded conditions that would ripple through the chronicles of women in power and forgotten queens of history, insisting that Brittany retain certain autonomous rights, that she maintain control over her own financial revenues, and most crucially, that if Louis died before she did, she would not be compelled to marry his successor, thus breaking the vicious cycle that had once seen her transferred like an heirloom between kings. And Louis, for all his ambitions, recognized the steely resolve in the eyes of a woman who had lost children, kingdoms, and illusions, and who had nothing left to surrender except her soul. And so, in a negotiation that would etch Anne's name deeper into the annals of dark history, he agreed to terms that would have been unthinkable for any queen before her, yielding ground to a woman who had learned to transmute her suffering into leverage. And thus, in 1499, beneath the vaulted ceilings of yet another grand cathedral, Anne once more placed her hand into that of a king. But this time, it was not an act of total surrender. For her eyes no longer held the hollow stare of a trapped girl, but glimmered with the silent triumph of a strategist who had wrested some measure of autonomy from the jaws of monarchy and the wedding. Though wrapped in the same finery of cloth of gold and jeweled processions, as her first carried an entirely different undercurrent for courtiers, might whisper of pageantry and political alliances. But Anne herself knew that she had rewritten the rules of queenship, carving out small but vital spaces where her own will might still breathe. And though she entered this second marriage with Louis XV under the shadow of past humiliations, she did so as a queen who had learned to bend even the sharpest chains to her purpose. And as she walked the aisle draped in velvet, heavy as memory, perhaps a part of her dared to hope that this union, though still born of politics, might at least grant her respect if not affection. And it is into that cautious new chapter we must now step to witness how Anne of Brittany, tempered by tragedy, yet blazing with quiet authority, would begin to shape her life, alongside a king who, unlike his predecessor, was willing to treat her not merely as a prize of conquest, but as a partner in power, setting the stage for a reign that would intertwine both sorrow and remarkable influence in the chronicles of European history. Beneath the shimmering glow of candlelight cast upon walls embroidered with scenes of victory and faith, Anne of Brittany stepped into her second queenship with the same quiet steel that had kept her upright through the storms of European history and medieval history. And while her marriage to Louis XV was like all royal marriages of the era, born from political necessity rather than passion, there was a subtle, unmistakable shift in the air of the French court for Louis. Unlike his predecessor, recognized in Anne not merely a duchess to be subdued, but a formidable political partner whose influence could steady the turbulent tides of a realm stretched thin by foreign wars and internal rivalries. And so it was that Anne found herself wielding a kind of power that, while still hemmed in by the expectations of queenship, gave her room to breathe, to shape policy, and to craft a court that fused the elegance of France with the fierce, mystical spirit of Brittany. And within those vaulted halls, she cultivated an atmosphere alive with music, poetry, and the subtle dance of diplomacy, becoming not just a queen draped in velvet and jewels, but a patroness whose taste and patronage helped weave the cultural fabric that would outlast her reign. For in the chronicles of hidden history and forgotten queens of history, Anne emerges not simply as a tragic figure, but as one of the great women in power, a woman who refused to vanish into the margins of royal chronicles, even as the shadows of personal sorrow continued to stalk her footsteps, because while Louis offered a gentler hand and a calculating respect for his queen's intellect, Anne's private chambers remained haunted by the same relentless cycle that had tormented her under Charles. For her body, that battlefield upon which the future of nations was forever contested, continued to betray her with ruthless consistency, as pregnancy after pregnancy ended in miscarriages, stillbirths, or infants whose lives flickered out like candle flames in the drafty stone chambers of royal palaces, and each loss, though cloaked in the solemn rites of medieval mourning, was not merely a personal devastation, but a political crisis, fueling whispers in silk-draped corridors that perhaps God still frowned upon the union of Brittany and France. And though Anne, outwardly regal and composed, carried herself with a dignity that left courtiers awed and silent behind closed doors, she wept tears that no crown could dry her grief, a quiet ocean swallowing her from within. And yet, even in these moments of suffocating sorrow, she never relinquished her determination to keep Brittany's identity alive within the French kingdom, commissioning artists to depict Breton legends, ensuring that Breton language and customs were honored at court, and establishing schools and hospitals that bore the mark of her vision for a realm where her people might find refuge from the cruelty of history. For Anne understood that culture was a fortress no army could easily raze, and she was determined to leave behind not merely a dynasty, but a legacy. And amid all this private anguish and public duty, there came a rare and precious shaft of light in 1501, when Anne gave birth to a daughter, Claude, a child who not only survived but thrived, becoming the living embodiment of hope for a queen whose life had been so defined by loss, and for the first time in years, Anne allowed herself to believe in the possibility of joy, though even this happiness carried its own bitter undertone for Claude. Though cherished beyond words was a daughter not the male heir France so desperately desired, and Anne knew all too well how the absence of a living son could become a weapon wielded by those who questioned her worth as queen, and yet she poured every ounce of her love, wisdom, and vigilance into shaping Claude into a future queen capable of navigating the labyrinth of politics and survival. And it is to this fervent mother's race against time that we must now turn for as Anne's health began to falter under the weight of years filled with pregnancies, grief, and royal burdens. She knew she had precious little time left to secure her daughter's destiny and protect the fragile remnants of Brittany's freedom in the chronicles of dark history and European history. In the dim glow of winter dawn, filtering through the frosted windows of Château de Blois, Anne of Brittany, once a child queen who had stood defiant atop fortress towers, now found herself fighting an enemy that no army could repel and no treaty could forestall, for her body worn and battered by the endless tide of pregnancies, miscarriages, and relentless political battles was beginning to falter under the cruel arithmetic of time. And though the chronicles of European history and medieval history would later record her as one of the great women in power, those final years were marked by an urgency sharpened to a blade, for Anne knew that her life was no longer merely her own, that every breath she drew was borrowed time upon which the fate of her beloved Brittany and the fragile future of her daughter Claude precariously balanced. And even as her health declined, she summoned reserves of strength forged in the furnace of past sorrows, refusing to succumb to the quiet death of a woman content merely to fade into royal shadows, because Anne of Brittany had learned that queens who wished to leave an indelible mark upon hidden history and forgotten queens of history must wage their fiercest battles not upon open fields of war but within council chambers, royal bedrooms, and the silent corridors of dynastic intrigue. And so she threw herself into the task of securing Claude's future, with the same ferocity with which she had once faced enemy armies, recognizing that the French crown, ever restless and ever hungry, might seek to dismantle the fragile autonomy she had so painstakingly wrested from kings, and knowing that Louis XIV, though a more measured and respectful husband than Charles VIII had ever been, was aging and increasingly frail. Anne feared that upon his death, Brittany's slender thread of independence might finally snap beneath the weight of new royal ambitions, and so she orchestrated one final, audacious move on the chessboard of royal marriages, arranging for Claude to be betrothed to Francis of Angoulême, the man poised to inherit the French throne, a union that would ensure that should Anne's body fail her entirely, Brittany would remain bound to the crown not as a vanquished territory, but as a duchy tethered through blood and marriage. And though this maneuver was calculated and politically shrewd, it was also the desperate act of a mother whose heart still bled from 14 pregnancies lost to grief, and whose spirit refused to allow her only living child to become a pawn crushed by the same forces that had sought to crush her. For Anne knew that Claude, though young and gentle, would need to possess a spine of tempered steel to navigate the treacherous currents of French court life. And so Anne oversaw her daughter's education with a vigilance bordering on obsession, teaching her not merely embroidery and courtly manners, but the dark arts of survival that only a queen scarred by betrayal and loss could truly impart. For Anne understood that in the chronicles of dark history and European history, queens were remembered not for the softness of their gowns, but for the sharpness of their minds and the resilience of their wills. And yet, despite her efforts, her body continued to betray her each passing month, leaving her weaker, her nights filled with fevers, and the ghosts of children who had never lived long enough to cry. And though the French court moved around her with the polished elegance of politics, as usual, Anne's eyes grew shadowed with the knowledge that her time was dwindling. That soon the task of guarding Brittany's soul would fall entirely to Claude. And still amid her mortal decline, she clung fiercely to the final scraps of authority, drafting decrees, summoning ministers, and negotiating alliances, unwilling to release her grip on power, even as her hands trembled. And it is to these last fragile days we now turn to witness how Anne of Brittany, Queen Duchess, mother and indomitable survivor, prepared to confront the final curtain of mortality, determined that even her death would not be merely an end, but the beginning of a legacy carved into the annals of women in power and hidden history. In the bitter chill of January 1514, as icy winds swept through the towers of Château de Blois and rattled the ancient windows like restless spirits, Anne of Brittany, whose life had been a relentless war between destiny and defiance, lay upon her deathbed. Her once bright eyes now clouded with pain, yet still burning with the fierce resolve that had carried her through the darkest chapters of European history and medieval history. And though her body, ravaged by years of pregnancies and ceaseless political battles, had grown fragile as parchment, her spirit refused to surrender quietly, for even as breath became a struggle, and each heartbeat sounded like a drum, counting down to the end, Anne's mind was fixed upon the duchy she had fought to protect, and her prayers whispered into the silence of her chamber were not for herself, but for Brittany, that stubborn fragment of Celtic pride, whose fate she had tried to guard with every ounce of cunning and courage. And while the courtiers moved like shadows beyond her door, already shifting allegiances and whispering of new reigns to come, Anne's legacy was writing itself in invisible ink upon the chronicles of hidden history and the annals of forgotten queens of history. For though she would die at only 36, she had become more than a bride traded in royal negotiations, more than a queen whose body was conscripted into the service of dynastic ambition. She was the woman who proved that even in a world where royal marriages were weapons and women in power were scorned or silenced, a queen could wield silence like steel and transform her suffering into strategy, her grief into governance. And as her final moments approached, she must have remembered the girl who once stood trembling on the battlements of Nantes, watching enemy banners gather like a storm, and perhaps she would have marveled at how far that child had come, at how a duchess forced to marry her conqueror had carved out moments of autonomy, even under the heaviest chains, leaving behind not only a cultural legacy of Breton language, art, and memory, but a lesson written into dark history itself, that even when kings and armies and centuries try to bury a woman's story, the truth can rise again like the tide. And it is this tide carrying whispers of resilience and quiet rebellion that still flows through the stone towers of Brittany, echoing with the promise that some names like Anne of Brittany will never vanish into dust. So if there's one truth Anne of Brittany's story carves into the bedrock of European history, it's that even when the world tries to reduce you to a pawn, you can still rewrite the game, because real power isn't always won on battlefields. It's forged in quiet acts of courage and choosing to endure, negotiate, and protect what matters most. And maybe that's the secret hidden in dark history and forgotten queens of history, that survival itself can be a form of victory, and that even when the walls close in, there are always cracks where hope can shine through. If Anne's story stirred something in you, if it made you wonder how many other tales lie buried beneath the dust of centuries, then leave me a comment with your thoughts. Save this video so you can return to these hidden histories, and subscribe for more journeys into the shadows where women in power refuse to vanish, because together we can keep their voices alive and maybe find our own strength reflected in theirs.